Good evening, and welcome to California Confidential Files. We tell ourselves that the suburbs are a safe haven, a place to raise a family, to know your neighbors, to build a life insulated from the dangers of the world. We build our communities around block parties, bake sales, and potlucks. We build them on trust. Tonight, we travel to the idyllic community of Oak Haven, Illinois, a place that, on the surface, was the absolute picture of the American dream. We're going to look at the Patterson family, and specifically at Catherine Kate Patterson, a woman who was the very heart of her neighborhood. A loving mother, a perfect hostess, and a legendary cook. Every year, she hosted the Oak Haven Fall Chili Fest, an event that brought the entire community together. Her chili was famous. People talked about it for weeks. But this year, there was a new secret ingredient. While the neighborhood was celebrating, a dark secret was simmering on Kate Patterson's stove. This is the story of how she served her family and friends her famous chili, and the horrifying truth the police later discovered was inside. It is a case that will make you question everything you think you know about the people next door. So, if you're not afraid to look past the picket fences and into the abyss, you're in the right place. And if you find value in these investigations, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. You need to see how this story ends. Now, let's go back to a crisp October evening in Oak Haven, where the air was filled with the scent of autumn, laughter, and a secret that was about to be unknowingly consumed by an entire neighborhood. The Patterson house was the undisputed epicenter of Oak Haven's social life, and Catherine Kate Patterson was its benevolent, perpetually smiling queen. Her home, a sprawling modern farmhouse with a wraparound porch and a lawn that looked like a green velvet carpet, was a testament to perfect suburban living. And on this crisp Saturday evening in late October, it was glowing. Strings of fairy lights were woven through the trees in the backyard. A bonfire crackled in a large stone pit, and the air was filled with the laughter of children and the warm, contented chatter of adults. It was the night of the 8th annual Oak Haven Fall Chili Fest. At the center of it all, literally and figuratively, was Kate. She moved through the party with an effortless grace, a tray of cornbread muffins in one hand, a wine glass in the other, her smile never faltering. She was the kind of woman other women simultaneously admired and resented. Her home was perfect, her 2 children were polite and well-adjusted, and her marriage, at least from the outside, seemed to be a perfect partnership. Her husband, Greg, was the other half of the golden couple. He was charismatic and handsome, moving through the crowd with a practiced ease, refilling drinks, telling loud, booming jokes, and clapping men on the back. He was the life of the party, the charismatic salesman to Kate's steady, reliable CEO. But the true star of the evening, as it was every year, was the chili. It simmered in a massive 10-gallon cast-iron pot set over a propane burner on the patio. The scent that wafted from it was intoxicating. A complex, savory, and deeply rich aroma that was the stuff of local legend. It was dark, thick, and meaty, with a subtle heat that built slowly on the back of the tongue. People brought their own chili to the cook-off, of course, setting up their crock-pots in a long line on a banquet table. But it was a formality. Everyone knew Kate's would win. It always did. "What is your secret, Kate?" asked Sarah, their next-door neighbor, as she accepted a steaming bowl. "I swear, it gets better every year. The meat is so tender, and the flavor is I don't know. It's just so rich." Kate beamed, the picture of humble pride. "No real secret, Sarah. Just good quality ingredients, a lot of patience, and a little bit of love." She leaned in conspiratorially. "And I use a blend of 3 different meats. That's the key. Gives it depth." Detective Al Miller, a resident of Oak Haven for 20 years, took a large bite from his own bowl and nodded in agreement. Even off duty, he had a cop's observant eyes, but tonight, they were relaxed. Here, in this perfect backyard, surrounded by friends and neighbors, the grim realities of his job in downtown Chicago felt a million miles away. "She's right," he said to his wife. "It's the meat. You can't get that flavor with just ground chuck." The party continued in its perfect rhythm. Children chased each other with sparklers on the lawn. their laughter like bells in the cool night air. Adults gathered around the fire, their faces glowing in the flickering light, talking about property taxes and the high school football team. Greg was holding court by the drinks table, his voice growing louder and his gestures more expansive with each glass of bourbon. Kate watched him from the patio. For a fleeting moment, a flicker of something unreadable crossed her face. The perfect smile tightened at the edges. It was a look of profound, bone-deep weariness, so quick that if you blinked, you would have missed it. A moment later, a neighbor complimented her on the decorations, and the mask of the perfect hostess slid back into place. Later in the evening, as the party began to wind down, an argument started near the bonfire. It was Greg and another neighbor, a man named Tom, whose landscaping business had recently failed. The argument was about money. Tom was accusing Greg of not paying him for a private investment. Greg, his words slurring slightly, was laughing it off, telling Tom to relax and have another drink. Kate materialized between them as if from thin air. Her smile was still in place, but her eyes were cold. "All right, boys, that's enough," she said, her voice light but with an undercurrent of steel. She handed Tom a beer. "Tom, your wife is looking for you." To Greg, she said, "Honey, could you give me a hand with the dessert?" She defused the situation with the effortless skill of a veteran diplomat, leading her husband away from the fire and back toward the house. Detective Miller watched them go. He'd known Greg for years, knew he was a charmer, but also knew he was a gambler, always chasing the next big thing, always leaving a trail of disappointed investors in his wake. He felt a pang of sympathy for Kate. She was the rock. Everyone knew it. By 11 p.m., the party was over. The last of the guests departed with final, cheerful thank yous, their bellies full of chili. Miller and his wife were among the last to leave. "Incredible party, Kate, as always," he said at the door. "And the chili was out of this world." "I'm so glad you enjoyed it, Al," she said, her smile looking genuine but tired. "There's plenty of leftovers if you want to take some home. Don't have to ask me twice," he chuckled. She handed him a large Tupperware container, still warm. As the Millers walked down the driveway, Al's wife whispered, "She's a saint, that one, putting up with him." Miller just grunted in agreement, looking back at the house. The lights were going off, room by room, until only the porch light remained, a lonely beacon in the quiet suburban dark. Kate Patterson stood in her immaculate kitchen, the silence of the house a stark contrast to the noise of the past 8 hours. The room was a disaster of empty bowls, dirty plates, and sticky glasses, but her attention was focused on the massive, cast-iron chili pot, now sitting on the cold stove. It was almost empty. Only a few dark, meaty scraps clung to the bottom and sides. She stared at it for a long, unblinking moment. The perfect hostess was gone. The loving wife was gone. The mask had been put away for the night. The woman standing in the silent kitchen looked like a soldier after a long and brutal war. Her expression was one of grim, absolute finality. She picked up the heavy pot and carried it to the sink. She turned on the hot water and began to scrub, the sound of the scouring pad against the iron methodical and relentless, as if she were trying to scrub away more than just the remnants of a meal. She was trying to scrub the pot and her life clean. The pristine tranquility of the Oak Haven Police Department's reception area was shattered at 9:15 a.m. On Tuesday morning, the door opened and Catherine Kate Patterson rushed in, her face a mask of carefully constructed panic. The effortless hostess from the chili fest was gone, replaced by a woman on the verge of a breakdown. Her eyes were red-rimmed and wild. Her usually perfect blonde hair was in disarray, and she clutched a crumpled tissue in her hand as if it were a lifeline. She made a beeline for the front desk, her voice a high, frantic whisper that carried across the quiet room. "I need to report a missing person. It's my husband, Greg." Detective Al Miller was in his office, staring at a teetering pile of cold case files, when he heard the commotion. He recognized the voice instantly. He walked out to the reception area and saw Kate, looking small and fragile under the harsh fluorescent lights. His gut tightened. The easy, relaxed feeling from the party evaporated, replaced by the familiar, cold dread of a cop sensing a domestic situation about to spiral. "Kate," he said, his voice calm and steady. "What's going on? Come on back to my office." He led her past the curious stares of the administrative staff and into his small, cluttered office. She sank into the worn visitor's chair, pulling her cardigan tightly around herself as if fending off a sudden chill. "He's gone, Elle," she began, her voice cracking. "Greg's gone." Miller leaned against the edge of his desk, adopting a posture of non-threatening concern. "Gone where? Did he say where he was going?" "No," she sobbed, burying her face in the tissue. "We had that argument at the party. You saw it. With Tom. It was about money again. It was always about money." She took a deep, shuddering breath and looked up, her eyes pleading for understanding. "After everyone left, it got worse. He was drunk. He was saying terrible things. That he was a failure, that he was dragging us all down. He just kept saying he needed to get away, to start over." She painted a vivid, plausible picture of a man at the end of his rope. A man broken by financial pressure and personal demons. "When did you last see him?" Miller asked, pulling a notepad and a pen from his desk. The transition from neighbor to cop was now complete. "That night," she said. "He slept on the couch in the den. When I came down the next morning, Sunday morning, he was gone. His overnight bag was gone. Some of his clothes from the closet. He left a note." She fumbled in her purse, her hands shaking, and produced a folded piece of paper. Miller took it. It was a short, hastily scrawled note on a page torn from a legal pad. The handwriting was aggressive, slanted. "Kate, I can't do this anymore. I'm a mess. I'm ruining everything. I need to get away, find myself. Don't come looking for me. I'll call when I'm ready. I'm sorry. Greg." The note felt authentic. It radiated desperation and self-pity, emotions Miller knew were common in men who were about to abandon their families. "Did he take his car?" "Yes," she confirmed. "His BMW is gone. His wallet? His phone?" "I think so. I can't find them." She paused. Then her face seemed to crumple further. "He texted me. Yesterday. Monday morning. That's why I finally came in. It's like he's saying goodbye for good." She handed him her phone. Miller looked at the screen. It was a text message from Greg's number, received at 6:45 a.m. the previous day. It was even more final than the note. Greg's phone. "Kate, this is it. I'm done. Sold the car for cash. Got a bus ticket to somewhere new. A clean slate. Tell the kids I love them. You'll all be better off without me. Don't try to find me. Goodbye." Miller handed the phone back to her, a grim feeling settling in his stomach. This was looking less like a simple missing person case and more like a voluntary departure. A husband and father ditching his responsibilities. He'd seen it a dozen times. A man gets in over his head financially, the pressure becomes too much, and he just vanishes. He sells his car for pennies on the dollar at a used car lot, buys a one-way ticket to Florida or Arizona, and reinvents himself, leaving his family to clean up the mess. "Why did you wait until today to report it?" Miller asked, his tone gentle. "I was embarrassed," Kate whispered, looking down at her hands. And I was hoping he'd change his mind. I kept thinking he would call or just show up at the door, full of apologies. But after that text, I know he's not coming back. I need to know he's safe, you know?" Her performance was flawless. She was the perfect picture of a woman betrayed, abandoned, but still clinging to a sliver of hope for the well-being of the man who had wronged her. She earned Miller's sympathy and his professional assessment. This was a domestic case, a civil matter, not a criminal one. He took a formal statement from her, getting all the details. Greg's date of birth, his social security number, a list of any friends or family he might contact. She provided everything, her memory sharp despite her distress. She gave him a recent photo of Greg, a smiling, handsome man at a beachside resort, the picture of success. "We'll put out a bolo be on the lookout for him," Miller assured her as he walked her to the door. "We'll check bus station manifests, run his credit cards. If he's used his name for anything, we'll find him, Kate." "Thank you, Al," she said, squeezing his arm, her eyes welling with manufactured tears. "You're a good friend." After she left, Miller stood in the doorway of his office, looking out at the quiet suburban street. He felt a profound sense of pity for Kate Patterson. She was, as his wife had said, a saint. A strong, capable woman yoked to a charming but ultimately weak man who had finally broken under the pressure. The whole neighborhood would rally around her, he knew. They would bring her casseroles, watch her kids, offer their support. The community would take care of her. He went back to his desk and started the paperwork. He created a new file, typing in the name, Gregory Patterson. Status: missing voluntary. The investigation had begun, but it had begun on a foundation of expertly crafted lies, pointing him in the exact opposite direction of the horrifying truth, which was, at that very moment, being digested in the stomachs of an entire unsuspecting neighborhood. Kate's plan was working perfectly. For the next week, Detective Al Miller immersed himself in the shadow of Greg Patterson's life, and the further he walked into it, the darker and more convoluted it became. Every lead he pursued, every stone he overturned, seemed to confirm Kate's heartbreaking narrative. Greg Patterson wasn't just a man in financial trouble. He was a man living a meticulously compartmentalized life, and all the compartments were beginning to collapse at once. The first confirmation came from the bank. Miller, armed with a subpoena, gained access to Greg and Kate's financial records. Their joint accounts were a picture of upper-middle-class stability, managed with Kate's careful precision. But Greg's personal accounts, and the accounts of his shell corporation, Patterson Innovative Holdings, were a disaster movie. They revealed a man drowning in a sea of red ink. There were massive credit card debts, high-interest personal loans from shady online lenders, and a series of recent, desperate cash withdrawals. More damning was the investment trail. Miller started by interviewing Tom, the landscape architect from the party. In the sober light of day, Tom's anger had cooled into a weary resignation. "I gave him 50 grand, Tom said, sitting in his own quiet, grief-stricken living room, surrounded by moving boxes. "It was our retirement. Greg came to me with this can't-miss opportunity, some new medical tech startup. He had charts, projections, he was so convincing." Tom shook his head, the shame palpable. "He promised me a 30% return in 6 months. That was a year ago. I've been trying to get my money back for months. Every time I ask, he just laughs and tells me to be patient." Kate's party was the last straw. "I had to tell my wife we were losing the house. And he's standing there, pouring $100 a bottle bourbon." Tom's story was not unique. Miller found a half-dozen other investors in Oak Haven alone. A dentist, a retired schoolteacher, a young couple who had given Greg their savings for a down payment on a house. The pattern was always the same. Greg would use his charisma and the credibility afforded by his perfect life with Kate to solicit investments for ventures that never seemed to materialize. He was running a small-scale neighborhood Ponzi scheme, using new money to pay off just enough of the old investors to keep the whole house of cards from collapsing. But the cards were beginning to wobble. The narrative of a man fleeing his debts was becoming stronger with every interview. Greg Patterson hadn't just been in trouble. He was on the verge of being exposed as a fraud to his entire community. The shame alone was a powerful motive to disappear. Then Miller uncovered the second secret compartment of Greg's life, the affair. It didn't take long. A search of his phone records revealed thousands of texts and calls to a single number over the past 18 months. The number belonged to a woman named Serena Diaz, a 28-year-old marketing associate who lived in a trendy high-rise in downtown Chicago. Miller and his partner drove into the city to interview her. They found her in her sleek, minimalist apartment, a place that felt a world away from the cozy domesticity of Oak Haven. Serena was sharp, stylish, and not at all surprised to see them. "So, he finally did it," she said after they'd identified themselves. She wasn't crying. Her expression was one of cynical disappointment, like a gambler whose horse had finally pulled up lame. "He actually left her. Is that what he told you he was going to do?" Miller asked. Serena let out a short, bitter laugh. "He'd been about to leave her for the entire year and a half I knew him. It was always after the holidays, or once the kids are settled in school, or after this big deal closes. It was always something." She explained their relationship with a cold clarity. She had met Greg at a conference. He had swept her off her feet with his charm and the promise of a life she craved. He had a corporate credit card, put her up in a small apartment he was leasing in the city, and visited 2 or 3 times a week for his downtown meetings. She knew he was married. She had convinced herself she was more than just a mistress. She was his future. "He called me last Saturday," Serena said, her voice dropping. "The day of the party. He was drunk. I could tell. He was rambling, saying things were falling apart, that he was going to lose everything. He said he needed to see me, that we were going to run away together. He told me to pack a bag and be ready." "And did you?" Miller asked. "Of course not," she said with a roll of her eyes. "It was just more of his drunken fantasy talk. I told him to sober up and call me in the morning." "Did he?" "No," she said, a flicker of genuine hurt finally showing. "I never heard from him again. I've been texting him for days. He just ghosted me. And her, I guess." Serena's story was the final, crucial piece of the puzzle. It provided a destination, a reason for Greg to flee to something, not just from something. He was a man whose 2 lives were about to collide with catastrophic force. He couldn't sustain the affair and he couldn't sustain the fraud. So he had opted for a third choice: torch it all and walk away. Back in Oakhaven, the community had rallied around Kate, just as Miller had predicted. A meal train was organized. Neighbors mowed her lawn. The women in her book club took turns watching the kids. Kate played the role of the brave, abandoned wife to perfection. She expressed her gratitude with quiet, tearful dignity. She never spoke ill of Greg, only of her concern and disappointment. She was a portrait of grace under pressure, and the neighborhood's sympathy for her was boundless. Miller went to update her on the investigation. He felt a sense of dread about telling her about the affair, but it was his duty. He sat with her in her perfect, sun-drenched kitchen. "Kate," he began gently, "we've learned that Greg was involved with another woman." He expected tears, maybe anger. Instead, Kate just closed her eyes and let out a long, weary sigh, as if a weight she had been carrying for years had just been lifted. "I knew it," she whispered. "I didn't know who, but I knew. I could feel him pulling away. I told myself I was imagining it." A single, perfect tear traced a path down her cheek. "Is he with her? Is that where he went?" "We don't think so," Miller said. "She hasn't heard from him either. It seems he left you both." "Of course he did," she said, her voice laced with a newfound bitterness. "That's Greg. Always the easy way out, never facing the consequences." She looked up at Miller, her expression one of profound, heartbreaking strength. "Thank you for telling me, Al. It hurts, but it's better to know the truth. At least now I can start to move on. For the kids." As Miller left the Patterson house that afternoon, he was more convinced than ever of the narrative. The shadow of Greg Patterson's life was long and dark, full of lies, debt, and betrayal. His disappearance wasn't a mystery. It was the logical, inevitable conclusion to a life built on a foundation of deceit. Kate wasn't a suspect. She was the primary victim, the last person to be deceived. The investigation was all but closed. All that was left was to wait for Greg Patterson to make a mistake, to pop up on the grid somewhere and be found. Miller had no idea that the truth was infinitely more monstrous, and that the real monster was the woman he had just left, calmly wiping her counters and planning her family's future. The Greg Patterson case settled into the frustrating, stagnant phase that detectives dread. It was no longer an active investigation, but a waiting game. The Bolo alert remained active, His information was flagged in national law enforcement databases. But as the days bled into a week, and then two, a profound and complete silence emanated from wherever Greg had gone. There were no pings on his credit cards, no withdrawals from his hidden accounts, no sightings from bus station security cameras that matched his description. He had simply been swallowed by the vast, anonymous landscape of America. For the Oak Haven Police Department, the case was effectively closed, relegated to the teetering pile of cold files on Al Miller's desk. It was a domestic tragedy, a story of a man's moral and financial collapse. But in the eyes of the law, Greg Patterson was just another man who had willingly walked away from his life. The town of Oak Haven, however, was a different story. The gossip, which had at first been a wildfire, settled into a slow, smoky burn. Greg's affair and his shady business dealings were now common knowledge, whispered about at the grocery store and dissected over coffee at the local cafe. The narrative had been cemented. Greg was the villain, a charismatic con man who had fooled them all, and Kate was the saint, the wronged woman who was bearing her public humiliation with a quiet strength that was almost heroic. She became a symbol of resilience. The meal train continued for a full 2 weeks. Neighbors insisted on handling her yard work. When she finally made a tentative appearance at her children's soccer game, a group of the other mothers formed a protective circle around her, shielding her from pitying glances. Kate, for her part, played the role with Oscar-worthy nuance. She was grateful but not needy, sad but not broken. She was focused, she told everyone, on creating a new normal for her children. Detective Miller, now back to his routine of burglaries and traffic disputes, saw the Patterson family's story play out from a distance. He felt a quiet satisfaction that, while he couldn't find Greg, the community had stepped up to support the victims he'd left behind. It was a Tuesday night, nearly 3 weeks after the Chili Fest, when the first microscopic crack appeared in this perfect, solid narrative. Miller was at home, sitting at his kitchen table, going over some paperwork. His wife, Linda, was packing his lunch for the next day. She pulled a large Tupperware container from the fridge. It was the one Kate had sent them home with, still about a third full of the now famous chili. "Are you going to eat this, or should I toss it?" Linda asked, holding the container. "It's been in here for weeks." Miller looked up, a pang of nostalgia hitting him. He remembered the warmth of the bonfire, the easy laughter of his friends. It felt like a memory from another lifetime, before the party's host had become a fugitive and its hostess a local martyr. "Nah, toss it," he said. "It was great, but it's probably not good anymore." Linda opened the container to scrape the contents into the trash. "You know," she said, her voice casual, "I almost chipped a tooth on this stuff the night of the party." Miller grunted, not really listening, his eyes on a robbery report. Yeah, she said, pausing with the spoon midway to the garbage. "There was this little piece of something in my bowl. It was really hard, like a rock or a piece of bone. I just spit it out into my napkin and forgot about it." She shrugged and dumped the rest of the chili. "Must have been a bit of gristle or something." "Your chili, my tooth," she said with a laugh, referencing an old family joke. Miller laughed with her, but as she rinsed the container, his detective's mind, a machine that was never truly off duty, snagged on the detail. Piece of bone. He pictured Kate's chili. It was a finely ground, slow-simmered concoction. He'd been eating it for 8 years. He'd never found so much as a tough piece of gristle in it, let alone a piece of bone hard enough to chip a tooth. What kind of bone survives 8 hours of simmering in a chili pot and remains that hard? The question was absurd. It was nothing. It was a random piece of cartilage. It was his wife misremembering. But the question, once asked, refused to be dismissed. It was a tiny, insignificant detail, a piece of conversational lint, but it stuck to the fabric of the case, and he couldn't brush it away. He didn't mention it to Linda. He didn't write it down. But the thought took root in a corner of his mind. The next day at work, he found himself pulling up the Patterson file, staring at Greg's smiling, confident face. He reread Kate's statement, her description of the argument, the note, the final text message. It was all so perfect. Too perfect. The text message, in particular, started to bother him. Sold the car for cash. Got a bus ticket to somewhere new. It was a clean, concise explanation for why his car and his financial trail would go cold. It was the perfect alibi for a disappearing act. It explained everything. But that was the problem. Life was messy. People who were falling apart, who were running away in a drunken, desperate panic, usually weren't that neat. They usually left a mess, a trail of digital breadcrumbs, a contradictory story. Greg Patterson's disappearance was flawlessly, almost professionally, clean. Miller decided to do something he probably should have done in the first place, something that had seemed unnecessary given the circumstances. He put in a formal request for a warrant to get a full data dump from Greg's and Kate's cell phone providers, not just the call logs, but the cell tower location data for the 48 hours around the time Greg disappeared. It was a long shot, and he had to stretch the probable cause to its limit, but he framed it as a final due diligence to rule out foul play before officially closing the case. While he waited for the warrant to be approved, he couldn't shake the image of the chili. The thought of the hard little object in his wife's bowl. A bone. It was ridiculous. He told himself he was a cop in a boring town, manufacturing a mystery where there wasn't one. He was letting the suburban drama get to him. But the thought persisted, a quiet, insistent whisper in the back of his mind. What if the most crucial piece of evidence in the disappearance of Greg Patterson wasn't in a file or a database, but had been served up in a bowl at a neighborhood block party, chewed, and then casually thrown away? The absurdity of the idea was matched only by the chilling sense that, for the first time in weeks, he might be asking the right question. The warrant for the cell phone data would take days to get approved. The judicial system moved at a glacial pace, especially for a case that was, for all intents and purposes, considered a non-criminal matter. Detective Miller was left in a frustrating limbo, haunted by a single, absurd detail, a potential bone fragment in a bowl of chili that he couldn't act on or ignore. He felt a growing, insistent unease, a sense that the neat, tidy narrative of Greg Patterson's departure was a meticulously constructed stage set, and he was the only one who had noticed a piece of the scenery was painted wrong. He decided to pursue a different, more delicate angle. He needed to understand the emotional reality of the Patterson household, not just the financial one. He wanted to talk to the children. Officially, it was to see if they had any information about their father's state of mind before he left. Unofficially, he wanted to see the family dynamic through a lens unclouded by Kate's perfect performance. Arranging it was a challenge. Kate was fiercely protective, a lioness guarding her cubs from any further trauma. Miller knew a formal interview at the station would be too intimidating and would be met with a wall of legal resistance. Instead, he reached out to Dr. Lena Fisher, a respected child psychologist who often consulted with the Oak Haven Police Department. He framed it as a wellness check, a non-threatening way to ensure the Patterson children were coping with the trauma of their father's abandonment. Kate, seeing it as a supportive gesture rather than an investigative one, reluctantly agreed. The meeting took place not in an office, but in the sun-drenched family room of the Patterson home. The two children, 12-year-old Emily and 9-year-old Josh, sat on the large, comfortable sofa. Kate was present, perched on an armchair nearby, her presence a silent, watchful force. Miller stayed in the background, observing while Dr. Fisher engaged the children with her gentle, practiced calm. Josh, the younger, was quiet and withdrawn. He spoke in monosyllables, his eyes fixed on the video game in his hands. The trauma of his father's absence was evident in his retreat from the world. Emily, however, was different. At 12, she was on the cusp of adolescence, old enough to understand the complexities of the adult world, but young enough to still possess a child's unfiltered honesty. Initially, she was a mirror of her mother, polite, composed, and fiercely protective. "Mom is taking care of everything," she said, her voice sounding older than her years. "She's really strong." "I'm sure she is, Dr. Fisher said, her tone warm and affirming. "It must be very difficult for all of you. Do you miss your dad?" Emily's composure flickered. She picked at a loose thread on the sofa cushion. "Sometimes," she said quietly. Then, she looked up, her eyes meeting Dr. Fisher's. But he was loud. A lot. Especially at night. Kate shifted in her chair. "Your father was under a lot of stress, honey?" she interjected smoothly. Dr. Fisher nodded at Kate but kept her focus on Emily. "It can be scary when parents are loud, can't it?" Emily nodded, a flood of pent-up emotion seeming to break through her carefully constructed dam. "He would yell at Mom. About money. He would say mean things. He called her his ball and chain." The words came out in a shocked whisper, a secret she had clearly been carrying alone. "He said he was a racehorse and she was a plow horse." Miller's pen froze on his notepad. This wasn't just a man struggling with debt. This was a man who was emotionally abusive, who belittled his wife, the very woman who was now being lauded as a saint for putting up with him. "That must have been very hard to hear," Dr. Fisher said. "Mom just took it," Emily continued, her voice gaining a note of angry defiance on her mother's behalf. "She would just get quiet. But I knew she was sad. I think we're all happier now that it's quiet." It was a devastating, honest admission from a child who had been living in a war zone disguised as a perfect home. Miller now had a motive for Kate that went far beyond financial strain. This was about survival, about protecting her children from a toxic, abusive presence. The interview seemed to be winding down. Dr. Fisher was gently transitioning to lighter topics. Miller was about to pack up, having gotten far more than he expected, when he decided to ask one last, seemingly random question. "Emily," he said, his voice casual, "you guys have that big party every year. Your mom must do a ton of cooking. Does she have a lot of fancy kitchen gadgets?" Kate shot him a sharp, questioning look, but Emily, a kid who loved to talk about things she knew, brightened slightly. "Oh yeah, she has everything. She got a new meat grinder a little while ago. A really big one. It's like the ones they have at the butcher shop." Miller's heart began to beat a little faster. "A new meat grinder? When did she get that?" "I dunno," Emily shrugged. "A month or so ago, maybe. It was right before the party. She kept it in the garage." Kate stood up abruptly. "I think that's enough questions for one day, Detective," she said, her voice tight, the smile gone. "The children are getting tired." Miller knew he was pushing it, but he had to ask. "Emily, did you ever see your mom use the new grinder?" Before Kate could stop her, Emily answered. "Just once," she said. "It was a few days before the Chili Fest. I went into the garage to get my bike helmet, and she was using it. She got mad. She told me to go back inside, that she was making a mess and didn't want me to get my clothes dirty." A chill went down Miller's spine. "Did you see what she was grinding?" Emily scrunched up her face, thinking. "I'm not sure. It was just meat. But the garage smelled weird." "Weird how?" Miller pressed. "I don't know," she said, looking uncomfortable under the sudden intensity of his questioning. "Kind of sharp, like when you go to the dentist, and like metal." "Emily, that's enough," Kate said, her voice like ice. She put a protective arm around her daughter. "The interview is over, Detective." Miller knew he had gone as far as he could. He thanked them and left, his mind reeling. As he walked down the perfectly manicured stone path to his car, the pieces began to connect in a horrifying, unbelievable mosaic. A hard object in the chili mistaken for a bone. A brand new commercial-grade meat grinder, bought just before the party. And a child's strange, sensory memory. The weird, sharp, metal smell in the garage. He sat in his car for a long time, the engine off, staring at the perfect, welcoming facade of the Patterson house. The image in his mind was monstrous, a violation of every law of nature and community he held dear. He had no proof. He had only a series of strange, disconnected data points. But when he plotted them on the map of his investigation, they all pointed to the same unthinkable, stomach-churning location. The bottom of Catherine Patterson's 10-gallon chili pot. Detective Al Miller drove away from the Patterson house with a cold, sickening certainty churning in his gut. He was a man who dealt in facts, in evidence, in the tangible proof of human transgression. But what he had now was a ghost story, a ghastly narrative woven from a wife's misremembered bite of chili and a child's fleeting, sensory memory. It was a theory so monstrous, so far outside the bounds of Oak Haven's suburban reality, that to speak it aloud would sound like madness. He knew he couldn't get a search warrant based on this. A judge would laugh him out of the courtroom. So, let me get this straight, detective. You want to search the home of a beloved, grieving mother because her daughter says the garage smelled like metal? It was impossible. He needed something more. He needed to bridge the gap between his horrifying suspicion and the world of concrete evidence. His first stop was back at the station, in the sterile quiet of the records department. He ran a search on Catherine Patterson. Her record was pristine, as expected. Not so much as a speeding ticket. But then he did a deep dive into her online life, her credit card statements, and her financial history, looking for the purchase of a meat grinder. It wasn't easy. She was careful. But after hours of cross-referencing shipping manifests from restaurant supply companies, he found it. 2.5 weeks before the Chili Fest, Catherine Patterson had purchased a Hobart 4246 commercial meat grinder. It was a stainless steel beast, a half-horsepower engine capable of grinding over 40 pounds of meat per minute. It was the kind of machine a high-volume butcher shop or a small-scale meat processing plant would use. It was absurd, ludicrous overkill for a suburban mother making chili once a year. The purchase had been made online, shipped not to her home, but to a commercial mail drop in a neighboring town, and paid for with a prepaid debit card. She had tried to hide it. She had known, even before she used it, that it was a tool for a secret, terrible purpose. This was the piece he needed. It was tangible. It was suspicious. It was enough. Miller spent the next 24 hours meticulously crafting his affidavit for a search warrant. He laid out every piece of the puzzle. Greg Patterson's complete and total disappearance off the grid, which was statistically anomalous even for men who flee. The suspicious, perfectly worded final text message. His wife's report of a hard, bone-like object in the chili. The daughter's testimony about the grinder, its secret use, and the strange metallic smell. And finally, the proof of the grinder's purchasing a commercial-grade machine, bought surreptitiously. He presented it to a judge the next morning. The judge read the affidavit slowly, his expression shifting from skepticism to a deep, troubled concern. He looked up at Miller, his eyes wide. "Detective," he said, his voice low, "I hope to God you're wrong about this." He signed the warrant. Miller assembled his team. He chose them carefully. 2 of his most trusted senior detectives and a 2-person forensics unit from the county. He briefed them in a closed-door meeting, laying out the timeline and his theory. The room was silent, the detectives looking at him with a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Al," one of them finally said, "you're saying that Kate Patterson, that she and then she served it to us?" The detective had been at the party. "That's the theory we're here to prove or disprove," Miller said, his voice grim. "Let's go find out." They arrived at the Patterson house in the middle of a placid Wednesday afternoon. The illusion of suburban tranquility was shattered by the arrival of the 2 unmarked police cars and the county forensics van. Neighbors peeked out from behind their curtains, their faces etched with confusion. Kate answered the door. When she saw Miller, flanked by his team, her face went pale. When he handed her the signed search warrant, her mask of composure didn't just crack. It disintegrated. For a moment, she looked not like a monster, but like a trapped, terrified animal. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, she went cold. Her expression became a blank slate of ice. "You have no right," she said, her voice a dead, flat monotone. "We have a warrant, Kate," Miller said gently. "We need you to wait in the living room with an officer while we conduct our search." The house was, as always, immaculate. It smelled of lemon polish and fresh flowers. The team moved with a quiet, professional purpose. 2 detectives started upstairs, in the master bedroom and Greg's office. Miller and the forensics team went straight to the garage. It was the quintessential suburban garage. impeccably organized. Lawnmowers and gardening tools hung neatly on the walls. Bicycles were mounted on a rack. Shelving units were filled with clearly labeled plastic bins. There was no sign of a meat grinder. "She must have gotten rid of it," one of the detectives said. "No," Miller said, scanning the space. "She's a planner. She's meticulous. She wouldn't just dump it somewhere it could be found. It's here." He ran his hand along the bottom of a large metal workbench. His fingers brushed against a set of fresh, deep scratches in the concrete floor. He crouched down. They were drag marks. Something heavy had been dragged from the center of the garage and pushed into the corner. He looked at the corner. It was filled with a stack of large, empty cardboard boxes, ostensibly for recycling. Miller moved the boxes, and there, tucked away behind them, was the Hobart 4246. It was gleaming, spotless. It looked like it had just come out of the factory. The forensics team immediately went to work. They set up portable lights, their cameras flashing. They began the slow, painstaking process of disassembling the machine, piece by piece. The outer casing was clean. The feeding tray was clean. The auger, the heavy, corkscrew-like piece that pushes the meat toward the blades, was clean. "She scrubbed it with bleach, Al," the lead tech said, her voice muffled by her mask. "If there was anything here, it's long gone." Miller felt a surge of frustration and a flicker of doubt. Had he been wrong? Had he just terrorized a grieving family based on a wild, monstrous fantasy? He watched as the tech, a woman named Maria, carefully removed the final, most crucial piece. The grinder plate, a thick, steel disc perforated with small holes, and the star-shaped blade that sat behind it. She laid them on a clean, sterile cloth under the bright lights. She sprayed them with a chemical reagent. Nothing. They had been scoured clean. "Wait," Maria said, leaning in closer. She took a pair of dental picks and began to gently, meticulously scrape at the central hub of the star-shaped blade, the point where it attached to the auger's drive shaft. It was a tight, recessed space, almost impossible to clean perfectly. She worked for a full minute in tense silence. Then she used the pick to lift something out. It was a tiny, almost microscopic fragment, no bigger than a grain of sand. It was grayish-white, with a faint metallic sheen. "What is it?" Miller asked, leaning in. "I'm not sure," Maria said, carefully placing it in a small evidence vial. "Looks like a metal shaving of some kind. Titanium, maybe? It's not magnetic." Miller's mind flashed. Titanium. The word echoed in the silent garage. He felt a jolt, a sudden electric connection. He pulled out his phone and called the station. "It's Miller," he said, his voice tight. "I need you to pull Greg Patterson's full medical records. Right now. I'm looking for a surgery. Orthopedic. Maybe 10, 15 years ago." He waited, the silence in the garage stretching for an eternity, broken only by the quiet clicks of the forensics camera. The detective on the other end of the line came back a minute later. "You're not going to believe this, Al," the detective said. "Patterson Gregory, age 29. Emergency surgery following a skiing accident in Aspen. Compound fracture of the left femur. The surgeon implanted a..." Miller finished the sentence for him, his voice a grim whisper. "A titanium pin." The word titanium hung in the sterile air of the garage. A small, metallic syllable that changed everything. It transformed a monstrous theory into a provable, horrifying fact. It was the linchpin, the single, unassailable piece of physical evidence that connected Greg Patterson's body to this gleaming, meticulously cleaned machine. While the forensics team continued their painstaking work, cataloging the grinder and swabbing every surface of the garage, Detective Miller stood on the driveway, the cool autumn air doing nothing to quell the fire in his gut. He now knew, with a certainty that made him feel physically ill, what had happened in this perfect suburban home. But knowing wasn't enough. He had to prove it beyond any conceivable doubt. The grinder proved the how. He still needed to prove the what. He needed to connect the machine to the meal. He thought of the Tupperware container. His Tupperware container. the one that had been sitting in the evidence locker at the station for the past week. A piece of the puzzle he had collected before he even knew what the puzzle looked like. At the time, logging his wife's leftovers into evidence had felt ridiculous, an act of paranoid overreach. Now, it felt like the single most important piece of police work he had done in his career. He called Maria, the lead forensics tech, over to his car. "I have a sample of the chili," he said, his voice low. "From the night of the party. It's at the station. I need you to run it. I need to know what's in it." Maria looked at him, her eyes wide above her mask. She understood the implication immediately. "You think, Al, you can't possibly think she?" "I don't know what I think anymore," he said grimly. "Just test it. Run a full DNA panel. See if you find anything that isn't supposed to be in a bowl of chili." As the forensics team packed up their equipment, Miller and his partner did a final, slow walkthrough of the house. Kate was still in the living room, sitting ramrod straight on the sofa, an officer standing quietly in the corner. Her face was a blank, emotionless mask. She watched them with dead eyes as they moved through her home, her perfect world now an officially designated crime scene. There was no fear left in her expression. There was only a cold, profound emptiness, the look of a person who knew the game was over. Back at the lab, Maria fast-tracked the analysis. The process was slow and delicate. Extracting viable DNA from a substance that had been slow-cooked for 8 hours, then refrigerated for weeks, was a forensic nightmare. They worked through the night under the harsh, humming lights of the lab. Miller didn't go home. He sat in his office, the door closed, staring at the Patterson case file spread across his desk. The smiling photo of Greg, the tearful texts from Kate, the witness statements from the party guests, it was all a lie, a meticulously constructed fiction. He felt a wave of nausea as he remembered enjoying that chili, of complimenting Kate on its rich, savory flavor. He and dozens of his friends and neighbors had been unwitting participants in a grotesque, cannibalistic ritual. They hadn't just been witnesses to a crime. They had consumed the evidence. The call from Maria came just before dawn. Miller snatched the phone before the first ring had finished. "You were right, Al," Maria said, her voice strained with a mixture of exhaustion and professional shock. "I've never seen anything like this." "What did you find?" he asked, his own voice a hoarse whisper. "It was a mess to isolate," she explained. "But we got it." The sample contained degraded but readable DNA from 3 distinct animal species: beef, pork, and, she paused, taking a deep breath, and human, male. We ran it against the DNA from the toothbrush we collected from Greg Patterson's bathroom. Miller held his breath, waiting for the words he already knew were coming. "It's a perfect match, Al," Maria said, her voice dropping. "It's a familial match to his daughter, Emily, and a direct match to the sample from the toothbrush. There is no doubt. The secret ingredient in Kate Patterson's chili was her husband." Miller hung up the phone. He sat in the pre-dawn quiet of his office, the words echoing in the silence. "It's a perfect match." He felt no sense of victory, no triumph of a case solved. He felt only a profound, soul-deep sickness. The shadow of Greg Patterson's life had finally led him not to a bus station in a faraway state, but to a Tupperware container in his own refrigerator. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out as the first pale light of dawn began to creep over the quiet, sleeping rooftops of Oak Haven. A new day was beginning, but for this perfect, peaceful suburb, the sun was about to rise on a nightmare from which it would never fully awaken. He picked up his keys. It was time to go back to the Patterson house. It was time to make an arrest. The waiting game was over. The hunt was over. All that was left was the confession, and the horrifying answer to the one question that still remained. Not how or what, but why. Why would a woman like Catherine Patterson commit an act of such unimaginable, monstrous brutality? He had a feeling the answer would be as chilling and as complex as the crime itself. The morning sun cast long, gentle shadows across the manicured lawns of Oak Haven as Detective Miller's car pulled into the Pattersons' driveway for the final time. The yellow crime scene tape, stark and alien against the tranquil suburban backdrop, fluttered in the early morning breeze. He had 2 uniformed officers with him, but he was going in first. Alone. This was his case. This was his town. This was his neighbor. He needed to be the one to look her in the eye. Kate was in the kitchen, sitting at the large rustic farmhouse table where her family had shared 1,000 happy meals. She was dressed not in pajamas, but in a crisp blouse and tailored slacks. Her hair was done. Her makeup was applied. She was holding a mug of coffee, her hands perfectly steady. She looked up as Miller entered, her expression not of fear or surprise, but of weary, inevitable acceptance. She had been waiting for him. "Good morning, Al," she said, her voice calm and clear, as if he had just stopped by for a neighborly chat. "Kate," he said, his own voice sounding rough in the pristine silence of the kitchen. "I have a warrant for your arrest for the murder of your husband, Gregory Patterson." She took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee. "I see," she said. "The grinder, I assume? I knew I should have gotten rid of it. But it was so heavy." She spoke of it with the casual annoyance of someone discussing a piece of furniture that didn't fit the room. The lack of emotion was more chilling than a scream would have been. Miller read her rights, the familiar words sounding surreal in the sun-drenched, gourmet kitchen. She listened patiently, then nodded. "I understand," she said. "I won't be needing a lawyer." At the station, she was led not to the small, intimidating interrogation room, but to a slightly larger, softer interview room, the kind usually reserved for sensitive witnesses. Miller wanted to give her every chance to feel safe, to let the dam of her composure break. But there was no dam. There was only a wall of solid ice. She sat across the table from him, her posture perfect, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked like a PTA mom about to discuss fundraising for the school library. Miller started by laying out the evidence, piece by piece, on the table between them. He showed her the lab report on the titanium fragments found in the grinder. She glanced at it with a flicker of what looked like professional interest. "Titanium," she mused. "Stronger than bone. I suppose that makes sense. It would be difficult to grind." Miller ignored her clinical observation and pushed the second report across the table. It was the DNA analysis of the chili. He watched her face closely as she read the words. "DNA profile is a direct match to Gregory M. Patterson." He was waiting for the breakdown, for the tears, for the confession born of guilt and horror. He was waiting for the Catherine Patterson he thought he knew, the kind, loving, overwhelmed Wifido finally emerge. She didn't. Kate looked up from the report, her eyes meeting his, and for the first time Miller saw her. He saw past the perfect hostess, past the grieving wife, past the resilient community icon. He saw the real Catherine Patterson. Her eyes were not filled with remorse. They were filled with a cold, clear, and absolute certainty. The mask didn't just break. It evaporated, revealing the face of a stranger, a woman of terrifying, unshakable resolve. "You're a good detective, Al," she said, her voice calm, almost admiring. "More thorough than I gave you credit for." And then she confessed. It wasn't a confession wrung from her by guilt or pressure. It was a statement, a debriefing, a final, factual report from a mission that had been, in her eyes, almost perfectly executed. "He was a cancer," she began, her voice even and measured. "Everyone in this town saw Greg as the charming, successful life of the party. You all saw the man I was supposed to be lucky to have. But you didn't see the man who came home after the party was over. You didn't see the man who would lose our savings on a bad stock tip and then scream at me for buying the wrong brand of coffee. You didn't see the man who told his own daughter that she was getting chunky and would never find a husband." She spoke of his abuse not with the fire of a victim, but with the cold analysis of a scientist describing a disease. She detailed the years of emotional manipulation, the gaslighting, the mounting debts that threatened to swallow them whole, and the slow, corrosive effect it had on her and her children. "I tried to leave," she said, a flicker of the old, familiar sadness in her eyes. "Years ago, but he threatened me. He said he would take the children, that he would ruin me, tell everyone I was crazy, unstable. And I knew he could do it. With his charm, everyone would have believed him. They would have brought him casseroles. She explained that the night of the Chili Fest was the breaking point. His public argument with Tom, the casual cruelty of his drunkenness, the look of fear in her children's eyes. Something inside her had simply snapped. Not in a fit of rage, but with the cold, quiet click of a switch being flipped. I realized, she said, leaning forward, her gaze intense, that there was no escape, there was no leaving him. The only way to save my children, to save myself from the slow death he was inflicting on us, was not to leave the house, but to remove the problem. Permanently. The words hung in the air, cold and sharp as shards of glass. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was an execution, a calculated, deliberate act of self-preservation, carried out with the ruthless efficiency of a surgeon removing a tumor. Miller sat in stunned silence, listening to the calm, rational confession of a monster who believed she was a savior. He had expected to find a broken woman. Instead, he had found a woman who had been broken for years and had finally, terrifyingly, decided to put herself back together using the pieces of her husband. If Catherine Patterson's confession of the murder was chilling in its calm, her explanation of the aftermath was a descent into a new circle of hell, a place where logic and monstrosity became indistinguishable. She spoke not of a frantic, panicked cover-up, but of a series of practical problems that required practical, efficient solutions. Once the decision was made, she continued, her voice never wavering, the rest was simply a matter of logistics. She recounted the end of the party, her voice as steady as if she were narrating a cooking show. After Miller and his wife had left with their container of leftovers, she had helped her exhausted children get to bed. Then she had gone back downstairs to where Greg had passed out on the den sofa, his drunken snores filling the otherwise silent house. He was so peaceful when he was sleeping, she said, a strange, almost tender note in her voice. It was the only time the house was ever truly quiet. There was no violence in her description. She didn't recount a struggle or a final, bloody confrontation. Her method was as quiet and as domestic as she was. She had crushed a lethal dose of her own powerful, prescribed sleeping pills she'd been given for the anxiety Greg had caused into a fine powder. She'd mixed it with a small amount of the expensive bourbon he loved. She had gently roused him, telling him he needed to come up to bed. He had been groggy, compliant. She had handed him the glass. One last one for the road, she'd told him. He had drunk it without question and had followed her upstairs, stumbling into their bed, where he had simply and quietly slipped from a deep sleep into death. It was painless, she stated, as if that were the most important detail. I owed him that much. The true horror began with the sunrise. She woke up next to her dead husband and was faced with a stark, logistical challenge. A 200-pound problem that she could not simply wish away. I considered all the options, she said, her tone analytical, as if she were discussing a difficult stain on a carpet. Burying him? The ground in the backyard is too hard, and the neighbors are too close. Sinking the body in the quarry? Far too risky to transport him. I needed a solution that was contained. Something I could manage myself, here, within the walls of my own home. And that, she explained, was when she thought of the grinder. She described going to the garage in the cold, gray light of dawn. She described assembling the heavy, stainless steel machine she had bought for this very contingency. She had known for weeks that this day might come. The grinder wasn't an impulse buy. It was a premeditated tool for a future she knew was inevitable. What followed was a story of almost unbelievable, gruesome labor, recounted with the detached pragmatism of a butcher processing a side of beef. She spoke of the difficulty of the task, the physical toll it took. She spoke of the need for the bleach, the industrial-strength cleaning supplies, the meticulous scrubbing of the garage floor. She had worked for 2 days, while her children were at school, fueled by a cold, clear purpose. She had dismembered her husband's body and, piece by piece, fed it through the machine she had bought with a secret debit card. Miller felt his own stomach churn. He had to stop her. "Why, Kate?" he finally managed to ask, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Why the chili? For God's sake, why did you feed him to us?" Kate looked at him, and for the first time, a flicker of something like surprise crossed her face, as if the question genuinely confused her. "But Al, it was the only logical solution," she said, as if explaining a simple math problem. "What was I supposed to do with over 150 pounds of ground meat? I couldn't just throw it away. Can you imagine the suspicion that would raise? A woman buying a commercial meat grinder and then immediately putting dozens of bags of meat out for the garbage collection? It would have been an immediate red flag. It was a waste product that had to be disposed of, and disposal was the single biggest risk." She leaned back in her chair, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. The Chili Fest was a miracle. It was the perfect delivery system, an annual party, a famous recipe, a tradition, provided the perfect cover for the sheer volume. Who would ever question a 10-gallon pot of chili at Kate Patterson's cook-off? Her logic was twisted, insane, but also terrifyingly rational. She hadn't cooked the chili as an act of rage or a final, ghoulish act of revenge. She had done it as a practical, efficient, and, in her mind, brilliant act of waste disposal. And there was a certain poetry to it, don't you think? She added, a small, cold smile touching her lips. Greg spent his entire life feeding off the people in this town, taking their money, their trust, their friendship. For once, just once, he was the one who got to give something back. The statement hung in the air, a testament to a mind that had gone so far past the breaking point that it had looped back around to a place of pure, unadulterated, and terrifying clarity. She hadn't just removed the problem from her life. She had recycled it. She had turned the source of her pain and her family's ruin into her greatest culinary triumph. She had served her husband to the very people he had betrayed, a final, secret act of what she considered to be a perfectly balanced and terribly just recipe. The news of Kate Patterson's confession did not break over Oakhaven like a storm. It detonated like a neutron bomb, leaving the physical structures intact but vaporizing the very soul of the community. The story was a virus of pure horror, spreading from house to house, phone to phone, neighbor to neighbor. The initial trickle of information from the search warrant had been unsettling, but the grotesque, confirmed truth was a psychological cataclysm. The story went national, then global. Oakhaven, Illinois, a town once known only for its good schools and quiet, tree-lined streets, became an international shorthand for the darkest, most unimaginable suburban nightmare. News vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes pointed at the sky like accusing fingers. Reporters from around the world camped out on the pristine lawns, turning the Pattersons' neighborhood into a macabre tourist attraction. But for the residents of Oakhaven, this was not a lurid news story. It was a deeply personal violation. The psychological trauma was immediate and profound. Sarah, the next-door neighbor who had praised the chili's richness, was hospitalized for severe panic attacks. Tom, the landscaper Greg had cheated, had to explain to his own children that the friendly neighborhood party they had attended was the scene of a horror beyond their comprehension. People who had taken home leftovers, who had fed the chili to their own families, were overcome with waves of nausea and a guilt so profound it felt like a physical illness. Every bowl of chili consumed was a memory now tainted with an unspeakable truth. The community's most cherished annual tradition had been twisted into a cannibalistic feast. The trust that had bound them together, the easy intimacy of suburban life, was shattered. Neighbors looked at each other with a new, subtle suspicion. If Kate Patterson, the perfect mother and hostess, could hide a monster behind her smile, who else could? The picket fences that had once symbolized safety now felt like flimsy, decorative barriers that could hide anything. The Patterson children, Emily and Josh, were the story's most tragic victims. They were immediately removed from the home and placed in the care of relatives in another state. Their names changed, their past erased in a desperate attempt to give them a future. They had lost their father to a brutal murder and their mother to a monstrous act, their entire childhood revealed to be a carefully stage-managed lie. The psychological scars they carried were immeasurable. Kate Patterson's trial was a formality. Her calm, detailed confession, played for a silent, horrified courtroom, was the only evidence the prosecution needed. She was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She received her sentence with the same unnerving calm she had displayed throughout, a woman who, in her own mind, had simply done what needed to be done. The Patterson house, the beautiful modern farmhouse that had been the heart of the neighborhood, became its tombstone. It sat empty, a dark and silent monument to the tragedy. No one would buy it. It was eventually purchased by the bank and, after months of legal wrangling, demolished. The lot was graded and seeded, but nothing new was ever built there. It remained an empty, green scar in the middle of the perfect suburban street, a place where children's laughter was now noticeably absent. The final scene returns to Frank, the host of Suburban Decay. He is standing not in a studio, but on the quiet, empty lot where the Patterson house once stood. It is a crisp autumn evening, almost exactly a year after the last Chili Fest. The leaves on the trees are turning gold and red. The air is still. A year has passed since the Oak Haven Chili Fest. Frank says, his voice a low, somber murmur. But for the people who live here, time has not healed the wound. It has only given it a name. They call it the silence. The quiet that fell over this neighborhood after the noise of the news crews and the horror had faded away. It's the silence of backyard parties that no longer happen, of potlucks that are no longer organized, of neighbors who now nod instead of stopping to chat. He gestures to the empty space around him. The house is gone, but the ghost remains. The case of Catherine Patterson is a chilling lesson in the banality of evil. It reminds us that monsters don't always lurk in dark alleys or shadowy forests. Sometimes they live right next door. They host parties, they serve on the PDA, and they bring you a casserole when you're sick. He looks directly into the camera, his expression weary and profound. The greatest horror of this story is not the act of murder, or even the grotesque act of cannibalism. The true horror is the violation of trust. Kate Patterson didn't just serve her husband in a bowl of chili. She served her neighbors a lie so profound it shattered their belief in the safety of their own world. She proved that the pressure to maintain the perfect suburban life, when mixed with years of hidden desperation and abuse, can create a monster in the heart of the American dream. And for the people of Oak Haven, the illusion of safety, the simple, trusting pleasure of sharing a meal with a neighbor, was the final and most tragic victim.